In 1848, 6 men led by their leader, Ludwig Leicharddt, attempted to cross Australia's island from east to west coast. Their journey was expected to last 3 to 4 years to complete. Their objective was to find and establish route as well as gather scientific research. Unfortunately, their trip didn't end well. Born in Germany, Ludwig had a huge passion for natural science and attended multiple universities to study this field. Even though he took a lot of courses, he didn't graduate. In fact, in 1841, he dropped out of college after a friend of his, William Nicholson, agreed to finance his trip to Australia so he can conduct his research. Traveling to a new country presented a huge opportunity for him to apply his study and to discover new things. From 1841 to 1843, he collected various rocks and plants. He then sent a copy of his documentations to Europe for the scientific community to check over and archive. In 1844, he heard that there was an expedition led by Sir Thomas Mitchell that will travel from Darling Downs to Port Essington, the northern part of Australia. However, this mission was cancelled after the government refused to fund the expedition because they thought that it was too dangerous for anyone to explore the unknown area, especially after a growing number of reports of dangerous activities. Also, financially, Sir Thomas Mitchell was asking a huge sum of money for extra equipment, which would cost 2 to 3 times as much as the normal expedition. At the end, the government didn't agree with such a request. Frustrated with the decision, Ludwig decided to start his own expedition to take on this challenge. He recruited volunteers and relied on private funding. Luckily, after many months of convincing, he managed to collect enough money to begin the dangerous journey. In 1844, he left Sydney to travel to Darling Downs, and from there, they started their journey to reach Port Essington. Throughout the journey, Ludwig mapped the lands they passed through and collected numerous plants, insects, and small animals for him to study. Traveling in these uncharted territories posed serious challenges, and they encountered a lot of problems. For instance, after their food supplies ran out, they hunted small animals for meat. They also came across some Aboriginal people who offered them food. Although they encountered some friendly people, there were also other groups that were aggressive. One night, while everyone was sleeping, John Gilbert, one of the members, was killed by a spear. They had to bury him there and then continued with the trip. He finally reached Port Essington on December 17, 1845. The journey took nearly 18 months. He covered roughly about 3,000 miles. The expedition revealed a route between the east and north coasts. But what's so impressive about this is that despite being underfunded, he managed to pull this off and made a name for himself. In 1846, he returned to Sydney by boat with a collection of rock and plant specimens and received a hero's welcome. He became the first European to ever travel through the north of Australia. He was hailed as the Prince of Explorers and was awarded with 2 medals by both London and Paris Geographical Societies. Unfortunately, he didn't receive these medals since he was still in Australia. He only read about it through the mail. So in return to say his thank you to society, he wrote a letter. On a small portion of the letter, he wrote, "I'm very pleased to think that such discerning authorities consider me worthy of such honor, but whatever I have done has never been for honor. I have worked for the sake of science and for nothing else." After his successful expedition, he wanted to explore more of Australia's uncharted territories. He had a very ambitious idea, and that is to cross the country from coast to coast. He planned to travel from Darling Downs all the way to the west coast in Swan River near Perth. No one had done this before, and most people advised him not to do it because of the uncertainty that he may encounter in the interior. He and his crew already had a terrible encounter during his first expedition, and that was a short journey. So given the travel distance is about 3 times longer, they most likely will stumble upon more dangers in their trip. However, despite the warnings, Ludwig was extremely optimistic and wished to proceed with the mission. The inland was unknown to Europeans. No one had mapped it, and Ludwig wanted to be the first one to do so. After he returned from his first expedition, he ventured to go on his second one just 9 months later. He was able to do this since he received a substantial amount of support and funding from the government. They set out from Darling Downs in December 1846. Just a couple of miles into the journey, they came across heavy rain and strong winds, but kept on pushing through. Eventually, the crew members caught high fever from the terrible weather. On top of that, animals ambushed them, targeting their food, and sometimes would outright attack them. After covering just 500 miles, Ludwig decided to abort the mission and return to Sydney. Even with all the potential dangers, he wanted to give it another shot. He organized a new expedition and brought 6 members with him. 2 of them were Aboriginal guides to help him. Along with them were 7 horses, 20 mules, and 50 oxes. Before they set out, they stayed at a station in Darling Downs. He talked to one of the workers and was asked where he was going. Ludwig responded, and these were his last words: "To the setting sun." From here, the group was never seen again. The expedition was expected to last 3 to 4 years, so after the time frame has passed and still no word from him, people grew worried. In 1852, the governor of South Wales sent a rescue team led by Hovenden Helly to look for them. In the region near Blackall, they found a campsite that he believed belonged to Ludwig. Near it, he discovered a tree that was marked L. There were 3 more carved letters, X, V, and A. The letter L was quite obvious. It's the initial of Ludwig. But the letters X, V, and A is what makes these things confusing. It can't be the initials of his crew members. The names of the 6 members he was with were Adolf Klassen, Arthur Hentig, Donald Stwar, Thomas Hands, Womai, and Billy Bombat. So just by looking at this, the only similarities are Arthur Hentig and Adolf Klassen for the letter A initial. And as for the X and V, it has no connection to the others. So these 3 letters probably do not represent names. Now, could this be a date? We can assume that X and V are Roman numerals, and together that would be 15. And as for A, well, it could be the initial of a month. There are only 2 months that start with the letter A, August and April. We can narrow this down further. The expedition set out on April 3rd, 1848, and traveling from Darling Downs to Blackall would take a couple of days, so April would be the one that makes more sense. Unless, of course, Ludwig took his time mapping every single section of the land he passed before moving on. Then the letter A could be August. Again, there is no clear indication that the 3 letters XVA represents a date. This is just an assumption, but it is quite common for explorers to put a date on their markings. This provided them a guideline on how long they've been on the journey and the distance on each marking. One good example of this is a tree carving by another explorer, Augustus Charles Gregory. As you can see here, it clearly shows the date, July 2nd, 1858. This wasn't written in Roman numerals, but it gives you the idea that explorers included dates when marking their spots. Gregory was also the second person who led the following search mission. In fact, this carving was created by him while he was out looking for them. In 1858, near the Blackall area, he found a carving that has a letter L. Apart from that, he didn't find anything else. Charles Hunt, an English explorer, received information from a party of Aboriginals that a group of Europeans were killed by a vicious tribe a long time ago, and a bone pit was rumored to be hidden just northeast of Perth. Now, it was thought that this story might refer to Ludwig's party, so the Western Australian government appointed John Forrest to lead the search team. Jemmy Mungaro, a tracker, claimed that he may have stumbled upon this pit during his early journey, and so he volunteered to guide them there. They left Perth on April 16, 1869, and headed northeast. Along their journey, they came across a group of Aboriginals who guided them to the place where there were many skeletons. After a couple of days of traveling, John noticed that they were heading to the direction of Poison Rocks in Shire of Sandstone. This area was where the English explorer Robert Austin had left 11 of his injured horses to die in 1854. So he thought that the skeletal remains may have been mistaken for Ludwig's party. Nonetheless, John's search team continued. When they reached their destination, they surveyed and investigated for weeks. They covered 9,000 square miles and found individual bones, but no graves or pits. The bones they found could be anybody's. Also, during this time period, DNA technology was not available, thus it's almost impossible to make any conclusive evidence. John wanted to believe that the hidden grave is out there and wanted to continue. The crew members, on the other hand, eventually gave up, since they feared that tribes who supposedly killed Ludwig and his group still roam around the area. At the end, after a grueling investigation, they came up empty-handed. It was theorized that the group encountered dangerous people along the journey and were killed. There were even rumors that some tribes practiced cannibalism, so that's why there isn't any trace of them. In 1896, David Carnegie encountered some items that he believed belonged to Ludwig. In the Great Sandy Desert, a party of Aboriginals showed them items that they were selling. Some of these items caught David's attention: an iron tent peg, lid of a tent matchbox, and small parts of a horse saddle. He noticed that the horse saddle was quite unique. There were markings that he had seen before and believed that it belonged to Ludwig's group. In 1900, 4 years later, a more significant lead appeared. A man who was herding sheep found a tiny brass plate, and on it had the marking Ludwig Leicharddt, 1848. He found this in Sturt Creek in Western Australia. It was stuck in a tree, and the plate was partially burned. They believed this brass plate was attached to Ludwig's personal rifle he carried on his final expedition. Now, by pinpointing the locations of the carvings and clues that were found, we can tell that Ludwig took a strange path to reach the west coast. He traveled up north first, then around the interior, as opposed to traveling straight across from east to west, which yielded a shorter distance. Most people believed he did this because he wanted to avoid much of the inland, since it was unexplored and could pose serious dangers. Also, since he already traveled up north to Port Essington, he was quite familiar with the first half of the journey and only had to worry after he left the Northern Territory. It was assumed that he made it as far as the Great Sandy Desert, and this is the area where he disappeared. In 2003, there was a discovery in the archive of the New South Wales State Library in Australia, which dated in April 2, 1874, written by W.P. Gordon, and this letter was sent to a clergyman named William Branwhite Clark. W.P. Gordon was one of station owner in Darling Downs who encountered Ludwig. He gave him maps and pointed out the route before venturing to his final expedition. According to Gordon, after he left Darling Downs, he befriended a tribe, and at one point they openly shared a story about a death of a group of European men. The men were ambushed by a large group of Aboriginals. They circled them, stole their belongings, then killed them with their spears. This all happened in Maranoa River. Now, there is a huge problem with this. First, the Maranoa River is located in Queensland in the east coast, which means that if this is true, then he and his crew died early in the trip, and all of the tree carvings that were found in the Northern Territory didn't belong to him. Or maybe these markings were made from his early expedition. On top of this confusing lead, there were strange occurrences in the following years. The carving letter L started showing up more and more throughout Australia's island. Some suggested that it may have been deliberately carved to confuse any search efforts, or maybe it was done by other explorers. Ludwig's disappearance was quite a mystery. With all the clues that were found, it is still unknown what exactly happened to him and his crew.